everyone. Welcome to week 3 of the Story Podcast. We're so glad you're joining us because we are going to talk about the life of Joseph. All right. Well, hey, it's great to be together. We are in the 3rd week of their study through the story, although we've been saying, it feels like we've been at it for a while. We've covered a long time in the history of the world.
Well, the whole world got wiped out and then started over again.
We've covered a lot of ground, but also really exciting. And chapter 3, which tells the story of Joseph and everything that's going on with that. You called it From the Pit to the Prison to the Palace. It may be my favorite story in the Old Testament. And I thought, Steve, you just did a great job with it. And so I'm not going to make you re-talk about everything you talked about on Sunday, but I want to kind of revisit those things.
You know, the burden of the podcast is we have to come and talk about
Something
it again,
new, huh?
And then somehow be deeper or more profound than we were.
Uh-huh.
I worked hard on Sunday.
I thought you did a great job. It was a really great message. So, yeah. And you were asking about the whole birth order thing. What's going on with that?
No, I was asking you about your birth order, but only because I know you came from a family that had more kids. It was just me and my sister. I was the oldest. I was the tormentor.
Yeah.
I used to pin her down and do that thing where you slap her face, tap her on the forehead until she gave up.
Yeah.
But
I have 2 older brothers.
Yeah.
I have 2 older brothers, and they were not the worst ever, but I was definitely the younger brother. I've got a younger sister, but actually she was always kind of bigger and tougher than me anyways. So I was like the baby in the story. But I was telling you, my parents not long ago moved to Lodi, and so I'm going to show my siblings. I'm gonna trick them and get the blessing.
Get the blessing now, quick! Get it now. Does that mean your dad's eyesight's got to go a little bit more?
Easy to trick. So
he still sees pretty good these days. So.
Yeah, but that's interesting stuff, the way that all comes out. But you have this fascinating story that starts with sibling conflict. Yeah, and you were right. Joseph doesn't handle it very well. He kind of brags, but he gets himself in trouble. His brothers essentially throw him in a pit, gets sold into slavery, and you think, well, that in the lower story is just terrible. And go ahead.
And that's some serious hatred. Like that is a seriously dysfunctional family. I kind of said that on Sunday. Like, what does it look like to live in a family like that where there's that much hatred that the moment that this kid shows up, that they're like, like let's beat him up, not let's teach him a lesson. Let's kill him.
Yeah. Until one guy's like, no, let's not kill him. Let's get something for him. So,
exactly.
I think one of the things you see is just the way sin carries down from generation to generation. Yeah. And it's so sad to me in the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, our fathers of the faith, they keep committing these same sins over and over again. So,
well, and we see a bigger picture with all of Israel who continues to wander away from God and be called back one.
Right, yeah. And I got that stuff in me too, so.
Yeah.
Anyways, one of the great things about the story of Joseph is there's an old expression called the providence of God that speaks of like the sovereign controlling hand of God. And so you definitely see this in the story of Joseph. It's a great reminder. And so he gets sold into slavery and winds up in Potiphar's house. And so, Steve, what are some of the lessons from Potiphar's household and his time there? If you want to just retell that story.
Well, he ends up going into Potiphar's house at the time. I'm sure he didn't get to choose. He just ended up being bought by Potiphar, if that makes sense. And you got to wonder how it played out. Eventually, this guy's his administrative gifts, his gifts of managing things, came out. Yeah. And immediately this guy's like, I guess I can trust you with this. And started trusting him with more and more and more until he's running the whole show. And we, sometimes I think we elevate certain gifts above others, but man, that administrative gift is huge. Yeah. And you can see how important it was, not just to Potiphar, not just to Pharaoh, but to the entire world that Joseph managed those things well. Yeah. And of course that gives him favor and it gives him, position in Potiphar's household. And
it says that the Lord's favor was with Joseph. It says it time and time again. And some of that maybe is just who Joseph was. Seems to be, this charismatic, good administrator, good with people, and obviously then God obviously gives him some supernatural stuff, ability to interpret dreams and stuff like that.
Yeah, both and.
But he gets himself in Potiphar's house, and I think especially for men, you right away he faces just this real temptation that the heart of it is it's a temptation to take something that doesn't belong to you. By the way, it goes back to the Garden of Eden too, because even the language is like, I've given you everything in my household except this one thing.
Right,
we've seen that before, and Adam and Eve fail in it.
Yeah.
But Joseph, stands up for that, and specifically this sexual temptation. Come to bed with me. This, you know, you got to assume Potiphar is a, you know, big leader in Egypt. Is got to imagine his wife was beautiful.
Yeah.
And so here,
trophy wife.
Yeah. And so you made, I thought, just an outstanding point about disappointment does not justify disobedience. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think
Unpack
whenever
that.
we're feeling down or feeling oppressed or we're feeling attacked or whatever else it is, there comes a point where we just, I mean, this is just human nature. We seek to soothe the pain in ourselves, and we do it in ways that we know are disobedient, whether it's turning to the bottle, turning to drugs, turning to pornography, turning to whatever else it is. We end up doing that and we think, well, but I deserve this, or well, my life's not going the way I planned, or whatever else it is. And so we instead lean into this idea of like, I deserve this, I should be able to feel okay, yada, yada, yada. And it always just leads to more and more trouble. Yeah. And for him, obviously, if you read the story, because it happens several times, it's like he always is like pushing it away, but it's not like he can escape the environment.
Right.
It's not, it's not like you or I, or an alcoholic not going to the bar anymore.
Right.
He's a slave. He has to live in this household.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it escalates to a crescendo when she grabs a hold of him while they're alone.
Yeah. And he does exactly what you're supposed to. He flees from sexual temptation. But I just want to kind of camp out on that disappointment does not justify disobedience thing again, because I think especially in marriage, you know, before long, people blame one another, whether it's in, you know, the sexual realm or just anything. It's like, well, if she would da-da-da-da-da, and if he would da-da-da-da-da. And so because of that, and then it snowballs to the negative. And yet you see obedience begin to snowball things up in the positive way. And I love that's what happens in Joseph's life.
That's exactly the way it works. It's so easy to look at your partner and think, well, they're not doing this for me, so I'm going to withhold this from them.
Right.
But because you're not fulfilling your end of the bargain, why should I fulfill my end of the bargain? And you end up in that snowball, like you said, where it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
And then the enemy, the devil, comes along and sprinkles a little temptation in there.
Yeah.
So there's a great saying in recovery. I mean, it's a little different than this, but it says you got to halt. It says you got to beware of when you're hungry, you're angry, you're lonely, or you're tired.
Yeah.
And you could add disappointed into those things.
Yeah.
Because it leads to a sense of kind of entitlement or whatever. So
and he's a young man at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm sure
married young man.
Yeah, he's got
seems to be.
Yeah. And so he's, but he really identifies it like, this is not just sinning against my master. This is sinning against God.
Right.
And sometimes I think we just think, well, we forget that we're sinning against God every time that we do that, because we just think, oh, what are the consequences down here in the lower story? And we forget there's some consequences.
There's one other part in that I think is really fascinating is also he's living in Egypt, which would have likely had different sexual standards than God's people.
Yeah.
And so here he is, holding on to God's standard in a culture that doesn't promote that. You get the same kind of feel with Daniel.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm going to be different, even though. So I love it. It's super inspiring.
Yeah.
One other thing too that I think a lot of us, I think especially in the kind of the cultural moment that we live in right now, he was falsely accused.
Yeah.
And so we've got this real entitlement kind of thing where if I'm falsely accused, then it's almost like I can do whatever I want. And talk to me a little bit about that. How do you handle things when you are, let's just call it that, falsely accused?
Do you know people in your life? I have one daughter in particular who's like this, who has what I call the justice gene.
Yes.
Like if it's not fair or if it's gone down in a certain way, then it's almost like they can't see straight anymore. They can't see to like pull it apart a little bit and say, even if it's not fair, even if it wasn't right, even if it's overall like evil, it's like I still have to operate in it. What do I do in the moment when I have to operate in that? He's being thrown into jail at this point,
Right.
and he didn't do a dang thing.
Right.
And it is easy to wallow in that, or to think, well, I'm going to take matters into my own hand. Instead, he sort of lives in that moment, continues to live faithfully, and it says the Lord is still with him.
Yeah. Good. Well, Joseph's such a great example in that. Anyways, one of my favorite verses, I just jotted down in the notes.
You ever been falsely accused?
Yeah.
I was going to say.
I don't have like big ones, but yes, I have.
Me neither. Sometimes as a pastor, though, people will say things, and they will assume my motives, or they will assume something about me, and I'm like, that is not at all the way that went down, first of all.
Yeah.
And secondly, but you know that feeling, that
Yeah.
righteous anger, where you're like, what do you mean? Like, that is not at all what happened there. You've got your facts wrong, you're lying about something. Online right now is a thing. All you got to do is give me a keyboard and a line of whatever on Facebook, and you can blast accusations with almost impunity,
and then it's
to
just
the
out
truth.
there.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when we have those moments where we've been falsely accused, slandered against all the rest, the question is, how are we going to respond in that moment? Not like Joseph had a whole lot of option, probably, but he goes to jail and he continues to just walk the line of faithfulness.
Yeah. I actually shared with you before, actually very recently, not to get too into the details, but I did, it wasn't a huge thing, but I had someone who I didn't know that well who didn't really falsely accuse me, but maybe misunderstood my motives and kind of
wrote you off.
Wrote me off.
Yeah.
And he reached out to me, which I was really thankful that he did. But my response was at the best was to say, man, what's he struggling with? What's he going through? Not to defend myself, but to try to put myself in his shoes, understand his shoes, and I said, hey, let's meet up, let's talk this out. And so,
well, I know what Potiphar's wife was going through. She wasn't going through anything.
So
he was just causing trouble at that point.
So, anyways, he ends up in prison, and there he learns to live faithfully and to wait for the opportunity. That is an awesome sermon point and super hard to do in real life.
Oh, man.
Wait for opportunity while you're living faithfully.
There's this entire story that's not really well recounted in the story. If you ever want to read through it, you can read that whole passage of Genesis there. But it's the cupbearer and the baker, and this moment in jail, which I'm sort of imagining Joseph is like, here I am. I got nothing better to do. And then these guys are having these dreams, and Joseph's getting this supernatural, from God, interpretive, action on these dreams where he can tell them exactly. And one of them is like a really good interpretation of the dream. The other one is not so good.
Right.
And it ends up going down exactly the way he does. But in those moments where you got nothing else except, the situation you're in, you need to live faithfully, and you need to live with expectation that God can work it in this situation, and that He's working for something in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, I agree 100%. What do you do when that takes a long time, or it maybe never even comes in this earthly life? We were talking just a little bit about how do you deal with that time of suffering? What do you say to the person who's, I'm living faithfully and it doesn't seem to be changing? Just, what encouragement? I think you're right. You just keep swimming. You just stay faithful. But swimming. Boy, to the person in the middle of it, it's hard to say that.
Yeah.
Pastor, how do you help someone through that?
So, I mentioned this obviously in the sermon on Sunday. I spent this season after I'd walked away from ministry where I was waiting tables. Yeah. And I can remember so vividly driving. It was a half hour each way to the restaurant. It was, sitting in my car and strapping on an apron and a notepad and thinking, and I got a master's degree. I'm like, what is happening right now, God? But I can recall just so clearly being in this restaurant and simply serving people. And I had spiritual opportunities. I had conversations with people that I never would have had if I wasn't standing in that moment. But there's also just this layer of necessity. I was still trying to put food on the table for my family and all of that. And so no matter how long, and it can start to feel long, I always tell people, work for the opportunity. Yeah. Like you don't necessarily just go, well, I'm just going to wait. Like you can be faithful, but while you're working towards whatever the opportunity that's going to come, if that's you and you're in a job loss situation, you go and you get the next degree, or you do the training through a trade school, or you do something to get a certification, so that you can make the connections to do that. If you're waiting, so many people are waiting for, that person to come into their life. They, we both got young kids that are like trying to find their person, and it's like, you could just wait faithfully and do your job, but you also need to strategically say, where do I go to meet quality people that might fill that need someday? Yeah. And you still entrust it to God. It seems like with everybody, the moment you're like, okay, God, forget it, whatever. I don't care if I'm single forever. That's when He starts to bring somebody into your life. But you not only live faithfully, you also live with the anticipation, expectation, and preparation. Those all rhyme.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Preacher skills.
Yeah, right, exactly. For what God has, that opportunity that's next.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think Joseph's a good example of that. He does. And God honors that, and he climbs out, and it's part of the coming out of the pit. Well, next he ends up in the palace. He gets put in charge of all this stuff.
Imagine that terrifying moment of walking into the palace, and you're like, well, I've been able to interpret these other dreams, but boy, I hope he has this very...
Don't fail me now,
Yeah,
Lord.
come on, God, don't fail me now.
Yeah, a lot of similarities to Daniel too. So anyways, you said the point that we need to learn there is that just to remember the upper story.
Yeah.
Talk about that upper story, lower story, and how that helps us even in working through those opportunities where we don't know what's happening or it's difficult.
So not to skip to the end, but kind of at the end, I talked about this idea of you really only see that in hindsight. And so when you are in the middle of that great opportunity, for him, this is that great opportunity. This is that moment. We've all had that moment, whether it's a job interview or something where we're like, oh man, if this goes one way, it's going to change the course of my life. If it goes a different way, I'm going to go back to whatever I was doing yesterday. And I could only imagine him sitting in that, that palace or that, gathering room with all these officials and people who have failed Pharaoh at this point. They haven't been able to tell him what this thing means. And he says to him, what are you going to do? And of course, Joseph's great response is he says, I can't. I cannot do it. But God can give you the answer he wants to give you. And immediately he gives the glory to God on the front end. And then, at that point, when you are acting on God's behalf, when you know that God has something for you to do or to lean into, in some ways you can release the results and just go, okay, I'm just going to be faithful in this moment. It's going to end up how it ends up. If I end up back in prison tomorrow, it will be what it is. But if this is what Pharaoh needs and God wills for Pharaoh to know this, boom, let's see what happens next,
That's part of the faithfulness.
It is, absolutely. You're still faithful, but so many times you don't see that. I very intentionally shared 3 pits in my life during the sermon. And then I gave them the end of that story at the so what. But the truth of the matter is, during each of those seasons, I didn't have any idea what was going to happen next. I didn't have any idea my wife was waiting on the horizon. Heck, I didn't have any idea First Baptist was going to be back in play. I had no idea I would end up back here. It was not on the table.
I remember talking to you when you were waiting tables.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we met at that Arco station at Gulf.
At Starbucks. I also just want to be mindful of the fact that, and preachers do this, is the story did work out. And God is at work. But sometimes God at work doesn't mean it always works out in a happy ending.
In our happy ending, like the way we define a happy ending.
There you go.
And that's the bigger picture of the upper story, lower story.
Yes.
God's upper story doesn't necessarily mean a happy ending in our lower story. When people, I'm sure you've had this happen. People will ask us to desperately pray for healing for so-and-so, and it doesn't happen. And that doesn't mean that the upper story isn't still going on. Many times we'll say in that situation, they were healed. They just weren't healed the way we wanted them to be healed, and they ended up in God's presence. But that doesn't console people that are struggling with the loss and the pain and the pit, especially if you've been in that pit for a long time. It is so hard to hold on. Sometimes you need somebody else to show you the perspective of the upper story. Look what God might be doing in this.
But I think one of the whole values of spending 31 weeks going through this is just to really get our eyes on that upper story mentality, that this world is not our home. And Tiffany did a great job on Sunday, closing with that song, "This World Is Not Our Home." So, hey, one of the beautiful things that happens in the upper story, entering to the lower story for Joseph, is he becomes kind of like a savior to his brothers. And
the world around him.
And the world around him, so that's really good. There's a little phrase in there, it's in Genesis 45, when he finally reveals himself, and they see him, and Joseph says, "Come near to me." Come near to me. And I just have always thought that's so powerful, because here's a moment where he could have been vengeful, he could have brought punishment, but instead he brings reconciliation. What do you think about those words when he says, "Come close to me" or "Come near to me"?
A little bit, that perspective element that we talked about earlier. You remember I showed that graphic? It's been 22 years since they threw him into a cistern. And through those 22 years, how often do you think Joseph has thought about his brothers? Joseph knows he's alive. They don't know Joseph is alive. Joseph has known his brothers are probably living back in the land, yada, yada, yada. and all of that. And so I just wonder how often Joseph must have played out the idea of, what if I ever encountered them? What if I ever saw them? And I wonder how God was maybe just working on his heart over the course of decades to say, when they come before you, you're going to be able to, because it feels like a supernatural forgiveness to me.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Right.
Where you've had to forgive someone where you're like, holy cow, man, I do not want to forgive you. Or my justice gene is going off and I don't want to forgive you. But when God gets involved, he says, you're gonna forgive them. And you see this really tender, like, embrace between them all. He's been longing to see his little baby bro, Ben, and he's finally sort of deceptively orchestrates Ben getting back and his dad getting back, and his dad's been living in a pit of despair almost his whole life.
His favorite son.
And then they take Ben away from him, and it's like, or the brothers are all gone, and you're like, I can't imagine what this guy was going through. And then to get to see his son Joseph again.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So, well, I got kind of a wrap-up thing to think about, but anything else? What else stands out, or what else should, people that are kind of reading through this or just kind of processing this, what else should we be thinking about?
The thing that messes with me, and I don't know if it messes with other people, is this idea that when pits come, there are enough pits in my life that I've caused. I know.
Yeah, right.
I know. I did this action.
Dug the pit.
Yep.
Climbed down into it.
Bought the car at auction. Imagine that it needs $10,000 in repair.
Oh.
Who knew? But there's some pits that happen in our lives that are of no fault of our own.
Right.
And Joseph ends up with that repeating in his life. Like he may not have handled the sibling rivalry all so well, but he certainly doesn't deserve to be thrown into a pit and left for dead. He does the right thing with Potiphar's wife. He certainly doesn't deserve 2 years in prison, right? And so we see these moments where, and one of the things that I just sort of think through is, I'm always trying to make sense of what is happening in my life. I'm even desperately looking up to the upper story, trying to figure out, God, what is going on with this? And there are some times where some things are going to happen to you and to me that we didn't bring on, and it's still ours to deal with.
Right.
It's still ours to handle properly. It's still ours to honor God in the midst of, whether it's I can think of, I must have listed them during that sermon. There's people that are dealing with grief and the death of somebody. I've done a couple of funerals recently I got another one this week that's for a 62-year-old, and that just sounds too dang young for me. And their families are going, why did we lose, this person so young? It's a longtime spouse, a diagnosis of whatever, financial ruin through no fault of their own. And you're like,
kids that have walked away or struggled.
Absolutely.
And I raised 3 kids in the same household. How come ever,
a spouse that cheated and all those. And so you have to look at this thing and go, there is sin nature that is real, and people act in sin, and it causes real pain and heartache and consequences. And the question is not, well, I can shake my fist because look, it happened in sin. It still leaves us to operate faithfully, to not give in to discouragement and act improperly. And that is something that you have to have a little bit of perspective on if you're going to live through that.
Yeah, good encouragement, good one. So, hey, our time's about up here, so let's just kind of look back. We've covered 3 weeks. We've covered the book of Genesis, and let's kind of wrap up the book of Genesis. And I think Joseph is so significant here because he really helps kind of wrap things up.
Oh, yeah.
And in a way, we're going to see this time and time again as we go through the Old Testament. It's always pointing to a greater need. It's always pointing to a greater Joseph, a greater Abraham, a greater Adam, who is Jesus Christ. But some have said that Joseph is even like a type of Christ, and you can kind of debate that around. Joseph's far from perfect. That's not at all that. But he does do some things that are very Jesus-like. One of the things that's interesting is the book of Genesis begins with brother killing brother, and you're like, oh, this is crazy. But then it ends with brother
rescuing brother.
Rescuing brother. Forgiving brother. Saving brother. You see, not only does he fulfill the blessing talked about to Abraham, but he becomes a blessing to the whole world. It says they come to Egypt and to Joseph. The whole world does to be blessed by him. You almost have this sense that Joseph is giving us a little model of the stomping on the serpent's head. And I don't know what to do with that other than to just kind of think about it and to find the hope in it. Because, man, we have come through some crazy stuff in the book of Genesis and some heartbreaking stuff. And through the crazy lower story, God is still at work. And so I guess I mean, it kind of comes back to this theme you said, is just to hold on to that. Because I don't know if you're listening to this today where you are. You may be squarely in the pit. You may be asking those questions why. God sees you. God knows you. And there is a truer and a greater Joseph, Jesus Christ, who once and for all paves the way.
There's only two ways to look at the events of this world. Either it's a random, set of events that don't mean anything and aren't going anywhere, or it's actually a story, and God's been writing it. And frankly, the way that you were talking about it is this is all foreshadowing.
Yeah,
He's showing where we're headed,
yeah.
And we're going to end up there at Calvary, and we're going to see how Jesus redeems the world and saves us all.
Yeah, that's cool. Hey, you having a good time?
Sure.
I hope people are. I've talked to a lot of people that have said it's helpful to just kind of think about the story, and people that are maybe it's brand new to, and so I love that. Hey, as a church, let's just be gracious with one another. Let's talk about these things together. Let's encourage one another in these. Invite people in. We've got more and more people studying these things, so let's do that together.
One of the fun things for many of our people who have known the Bible, loved the Bible, read the Bible for 40, 50, 60 years, whatever, these stories are like a refresher course, but there are people, and we know, we've been having conversations, who are like, I didn't know that story at all. And as a result, we are like literally increasing people's biblical literacy, and they're beginning to see God's big picture story because we're doing this again. So I hope you're enjoying it again, because every time I read the story, I find something else that I'm like, oh, I didn't think about that, or I haven't thought about that in years.
God's Word, living and active. So, hey, thanks everyone for joining us today. Hey, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to hit us up with those. We'd love to interact with you. I'm super excited about next week. We're already kind of leaning into the story of Moses that begins next week. And so, Steve, thanks so much for your leadership. God bless you guys. Hope to see you really soon.